The man responsible for the crime against Christine Morton was never questioned. The man convicted of the tragedy never touched her. The jury that sent him to prison for life heard no murder weapon, no eyewitness, no physical evidence of any kind. They heard a story, and the man who told that story won Prosecutor of the Year for it. Every person who followed this case in 1987 believed justice had been done. A husband, a private note, a motive built from a bedroom argument. The verdict felt obvious. It felt complete. What no one in that courtroom knew, what no one outside one man's office would know for 25 years, is that the story was built on nothing, and the real killer was still free. This case did not just imprison one innocent man. It would ultimately change Texas law forever, produce the only moment in American history when a prosecutor was jailed for sending an innocent man to prison, and force a reckoning with a system that protects the people inside it at the cost of everyone outside it. It began on an ordinary summer morning in Austin, Texas, with a little boy alone in the street calling for his mother. August 12, 1986. Michael Morton turns 32. He takes his family to the city grill for dinner, his wife Christine, their 3-year-old son Eric. Walking out to the car afterward, Eric walks between his parents holding both their hands. Michael picks him up. Christine laughs, head thrown back, completely genuine, and everyone nearby laughs too. The 3 years before had been hard, a sick child, money tight. But standing in that parking lot holding his son, Michael thinks, this is what it is all about. He wakes up the next morning at 5, showers, dresses. Christine is still in bed. He leaves a small note on the bathroom vanity, a private note, affectionate, a gentle complaint that she had fallen asleep on his birthday, and ends it with the words, I love you. He clocks in at work just after 5:30. That same morning, a neighbor notices something wrong. A 3-year-old boy is wandering alone outside the Morton home on Hazelhurst Drive, diaper soiled, shoes dusty, no adult anywhere. The neighbor walks the boy back inside and calls out for his mother. No answer. He moves through the house room by room until he reaches the master bedroom. Christine's body is hidden under a blanket, weighed down by a blue suitcase and a wicker basket. She is 31 years old. He had suffered severe, fatal trauma from a blunt object, with no signs of forced entry or theft. There is no sign of forced entry. Nothing has been stolen. There is no sign of sexual assault. Sheriff Jim Boutwell of Williamson County arrives and surveys the scene. Within the first hour, he reaches a conclusion. Husband did this. When Michael calls home from work, confused because Eric never arrived at daycare, it is Boutwell who picks up the phone. He says nothing about Christine. One instruction only, come home now. The questions that follow are immediate and hostile. Michael asks to see his wife. Refused. 6 weeks pass. The funeral is over. Michael is at home with Eric when the doorbell rings. He picks up his son and opens the door. Sheriff Boutwell is standing there with several deputies. They are not there to talk. A deputy steps forward and reaches directly into Michael's arms. No warning, no pause. Sheriff Boutwell pulls Michael's hands behind his back and locks the handcuffs in place. Eric begins to scream. He reaches forward with both arms, small hands open, stretching toward his father. As he is carried away, a child who had just lost his mother had now lost his father too, in the same month, in the same doorway. That image, his son's arms stretching out, crying "Daddy," would stay with Michael Morton for the next 25 years. And it was exactly what District Attorney Ken Anderson wanted the jury to forget. When the trial began on February 9, 1987, Anderson didn't look at the child. At 33 years old, aggressive and sharp, he looked only at the husband. Anderson stood before the jury with empty hands. No murder weapon, no witnesses to violence, not a single trace of physical evidence on Michael's clothes or skin. He had absolutely nothing physical, so he doubled down on the story. He told the jury Michael was responsible for the tragedy because she refused to have sex with him on his birthday. He read the private note aloud. He turned a tender, affectionate message, ending with the words, I love you, into the signature of a man consumed by rage and humiliation. Anderson was very good at telling stories, and this jury was listening. Michael took the stand. He was calm. He explained the note. He told them Christine was alive when he left for work. He believed the truth would be enough. Then Anderson called his final witness. Dr. Roberto Bayardo, medical examiner for Travis County, testified under oath that based on his analysis of Christine Morton's stomach contents, her time of death was approximately 1 in the morning, 4 hours before Michael says he left for work, 4 hours before his alibi even begins. The science appeared to destroy everything Michael had said. His defense collapsed in front of the jury in real time. What the courtroom did not know is that Dr. Bayardo had not gained access to Christine's body until several days after her death. What the courtroom did not know is that using stomach contents alone to determine a precise time of death is a method the entire field of forensic medicine states cannot be done accurately. Bayardo himself would later admit he could not determine the time of death with any real certainty. Anderson knew this. He presented it to the jury as scientific fact anyway. In his closing argument, Anderson went further. With no physical evidence, no medical support, and no possibility of rebuttal, he introduced highly inflammatory, baseless allegations regarding the nature of the attack to shock the jury, operating entirely without medical support. As he described the scene, tears formed in his eyes. Deliberations took almost no time. Life in prison. As deputies led Michael out of the courtroom in handcuffs, he said the same words he had said since the beginning, quietly, without drama. I did not do this. Nobody stopped walking. Nobody turned around. Outside, Ken Anderson told reporters that life in prison was not enough, that Michael Morton deserved the death penalty. Within 2 years, the state of Texas named Ken Anderson Prosecutor of the Year. Michael Morton was in a cell. The case was closed, the file was locked, and somewhere inside that file was something Anderson had never shown anyone, something Michael's own lawyers had always believed existed but could never reach. The question was not whether it was real. The question was whether anyone would ever be allowed to look. The door closed behind him, not with a click, not with the sound of tumblers finding their place. It closed the way a chapter ends, completely and without apology. Michael Morton's first cell was so small that if he stretched both arms out, he would touch the opposite walls before his elbows locked. 2 grown men lived in that space. The system controlled when he woke up, when he ate, when he was allowed outside, when the lights went off. He had no say in any of it. He would later describe what that does to a person over time, not as a sudden breaking, but as something slower, something that works on you the way rust works on metal, quiet, invisible, constant, until one day you look down and pieces of yourself are simply gone. He filed appeal after appeal. Each one was denied. The same machinery that had convicted him now held him in place. Every rejection not just a legal loss but a message. No one is coming. The world had moved on. The case was closed. The file was locked. And the man inside the cell was the only one who still believed the story was wrong. He kept a journal. More than 1,000 pages over the years. He wrote about Christine. He wrote about the night of the birthday dinner, the way she laughed, the way Eric walked between them in the parking lot. He wrote about the things he was missing, the ordinary things, the things no one thinks to name until they are gone. First steps he never saw, a voice changing, a boy becoming someone he did not recognize, because Eric was still out there. And for a long time, that was enough. Court-ordered visits, twice a year, 2 hours each. Michael would later say that visitation was like oxygen, not comfortable, not easy, but necessary to stay alive. He would watch his son walk in and spend the next 2 hours watching him, trying to memorize the details, storing them up for the 6 months that followed. But visits change when a child grows up inside them. Eric arrived as a small boy who called for his father from a doorway. He grew into a teenager who sat across a table and struggled to find things to say. The silences between them stretched. The ease of early childhood, the kind that does not need words, did not survive the glass and the guards and the years. At some point, Michael heard his son call Christine's sister Mom. He did not say anything. He understood. What else would the boy call her? She had been there. He had not. Then a letter arrived. Eric was entering his teens. He wrote to say he would like to stop coming to the visits. He was not angry, as far as Michael could tell. He was just done. But because the visits were court-ordered, Eric could not simply stop. He needed his father's permission. Michael wrote back with one condition. Come one more time, look me in the eye, and tell me yourself. Eric came. He sat down. Michael asked him directly, was this the last visit? Eric looked at the floor. He said yes. Michael turned to Christine's sister and said 3 words, take care of him. Then he stood up and walked out, not because he had nothing left to say to his son, because saying it would have changed nothing, and he loved him too much to make it harder than it already was. The visits stopped. The appeals kept failing, and the man who put him there was climbing higher. Ken Anderson had now been appointed a state district judge, sitting on the bench in the very same courthouse where he had buried Michael. He had built an untouchable career on this conviction, and no one in the county was willing to pull the thread. The case was closed. The file was locked. The state had no reason to look again. And then Eric turned 18. A notice arrived in the mail. Eric was going to be legally adopted by Christine's sister and her husband. He was going to change his name, officially, permanently. On paper, Michael Morton would no longer have a son. Michael had survived things that would have ended most people. The murder of his wife, the arrest on his front step, the trial where a man cried fake tears and called it justice, the conviction built on nothing, the cell, the rust, the failed appeals, the years. He had held on to all of it and kept moving. But this, a piece of mail, a legal notice, a name being erased, this was the thing that finally broke him. When I lost him, that was the end of it. That's when I had nothing left. 19 years into his sentence, the state offered him a way out. A parole hearing was scheduled. The offer was straightforward: walk out of prison, go home, breathe free air again. One condition. He had to confess to the murder of Christine Morton. He had to say on the record that he had done it. He did not know where his son was. He did not know if Eric thought about him. He did not know if he would ever see him again. From the outside, the math looks simple. Say the words, walk free. Michael's answer was quiet and immediate. All I have left is my actual innocence. And if I have to be in prison the rest of my life, I'm not giving that up. The board moved on. The hearing ended. Michael went back to his cell. 19 years in, the case still closed, the file still locked, the state still looking the other way, Ken Anderson still on the bench. And somewhere in the world outside that prison, a man who had never handled a single criminal case in his life was about to pick up the phone. 18 years into a like sentence he did not commit, Michael Morton received a phone call he did not expect. The Innocence Project, a non-profit legal organization dedicated to overturning wrongful convictions through DNA evidence, wanted to take his case. They had a name, John Raley, civil attorney out of Houston, medical malpractice specialist. He had never handled a criminal case in his life. When Michael heard this, his first reaction was simple. Are you calling the right number? Raley opened the file and started reading. He did not need to get far. A man planning to murder his wife does not leave a handwritten note on the bathroom vanity the morning of the killing, a note that draws direct attention to a private argument between them. That is not how guilt behaves. Raley kept reading. No murder weapon recovered. No eyewitness to any act of violence. Michael had passed 2 separate polygraph tests at the time of the investigation. The medical testimony used to establish time of death was built on a method the field of forensic science explicitly rejects. Raley set the file down and sat with a thought that would not leave him. The foundation of this conviction did not exist. He drove to East Texas to meet Michael in person. He needed to hear it directly, not from transcripts, not from case files, but from the man himself. He sat across from Michael in the prison visitation room and asked him to walk through August 12th and 13th, 1986 in as much detail as he could remember. Michael talked about the birthday dinner, Eric walking between his parents in the parking lot, holding both their hands. Christine's laugh. He said she would throw her head back when something genuinely struck her, and you could not help but laugh with her because it was so real. He talked about the alarm at 5 in the morning, getting dressed in the dark, leaving for work. And then he said something that Raley would carry with him for years. I didn't really have the opportunity to grieve for her. Everything changed so rapidly, away from her, to me. Raley drove home. He walked into his house and found his wife Kelly and told her, "My God, he's innocent. We have to get him out." She looked at him and said 4 words, "Then do it." Raley built a team and went looking for anything the original investigation had left behind. That is when they found it, a piece of evidence that had been collected, catalogued, and completely forgotten. In the days after Christine's murder, her own brother, John Kirkpatrick, had found a blood-stained blue bandana near a construction site roughly 100 yards from the Morton home. He picked it up and handed it directly to detectives. In 1986, DNA testing did not exist. The bandana was bagged and stored and never mentioned again. For Raley, that piece of cloth was everything. If it carried Christine's blood alongside DNA from someone who was not Michael, the entire conviction collapsed in a single test result. He requested access to the evidence. He was denied. He filed a formal motion demanding the bandana be released for testing. Weeks passed, then months. No response from the district attorney's office. Raley picked up the phone and called the DA directly. His name was John Bradley. Raley laid out the logic without drama. Either the test confirms Michael's guilt and he stays in prison where the state believes he belongs, or it points to someone else, which means a killer has been free for nearly 2 decades. Both outcomes serve the truth. Bradley's response was 4 words. It would muddy the waters. Raley did not understand the answer at first. Then he learned who John Bradley's mentor was. Ken Anderson, now a sitting state district judge, deeply embedded in Williamson County's legal and political structure, respected and untouchable. If DNA testing proved Michael innocent, the fallout would not stop at one overturned conviction. It would reach a career, a judgeship, a man who had built his entire professional identity on putting Michael Morton away. Bradley understood exactly what testing that bandana would cost. The motion was denied. A hearing was scheduled for March 2008, and the outcome had already been decided before anyone sat down. Bradley did not even bother to attend. When the ruling came down, Rayleigh got in his car and drove 200 miles from Houston to Georgetown, straight to Bradley's office, still furious when he arrived. He walked in and spoke loudly enough for everyone in the room to hear. "What are you afraid of? I can handle the truth. Can you, sir?" Then he turned and left. What he did not tell anyone until later was what nearly happened next. 6 years of fighting a case that paid nothing, against a political machine that had every tool to keep winning. There were moments where the pull toward work that actually paid was strong enough to feel like reason rather than temptation. Pro bono has a limit. Every attorney finds it eventually. But every time Rayleigh looked at the file, he saw a man who had chosen to stay inside a maximum security cell rather than lie to a parole board just to breathe free air. Michael would not give up his innocence, so Rayleigh could not give up his defense. He made a promise out loud, the kind a person does not make unless they mean it completely. "Michael, I promise you, as long as I'm breathing air, I'm trying to get you out of prison." He went back to work. In 2010, 6 years after Rayleigh first opened that case file, the Third Court of Appeals heard the argument he had been building since the beginning. There is no legal basis, none, to deny DNA testing of blood-stained physical evidence collected at a murder scene. The court agreed. Testing was authorized. The bandana that Christine's own brother had pulled from the dirt 24 years earlier was finally sent to a laboratory. While the results were pending, Rayleigh filed one more request. This one was for Ken Anderson's original prosecution files from the 1987 trial. Every document, every report, every internal communication from the case that put Michael Morton in prison. It was a request the state had resisted for years. This time it could not be refused. The bandana was in a lab. The files were on their way. For the first time in 6 years, both doors were opening at the same time. Rayleigh believed he was about to find proof of Michael's innocence. He was right, but what he was actually about to find was something much worse than he had prepared himself for. Anderson's prosecution files arrived. Rayleigh opened them, and what he found inside was not a gap in the record, not a missing document, not a filing error. The evidence of Michael Morton's innocence had not been lost. It had been organized, labeled, and sitting in a folder in a prosecutor's office for 25 years. The first report described a neighbor's account. On multiple occasions in the days before Christine's murder, someone had been parking a green van on the street behind the Morton home. The man would get out, walk into the wooded area behind the house, and disappear. The same wooded area where Christine's brother had later found the bandana. The report had been filed with the Williamson County Sheriff's Office. It had never been followed up. It had never been disclosed. The second report described a footprint pressed into the mud behind the house near the point of entry. No one had cast it. No one had preserved it. It was gone before anyone thought to look twice. On the sliding glass door at the back of the house, investigators had found fingerprints that did not belong to anyone in the Morton family. They were never run through any database, never compared against a single name. Then Rayleigh found the financial records. 2 days after Christine Morton was murdered, a phone call came into the Williamson County Sheriff's Office. Christine's missing Visa card had been used at a jewelry store in San Antonio. A local police officer said he could personally identify the woman who had attempted to use it. Nobody called him back. 9 days after the murder, a check made out to Christine Morton, signed originally by a man named John B. Cross, was cashed with a forged signature. A dead woman's credit card. A dead woman's check. Her killer had taken her purse the morning he killed her and had been spending her money across Texas for over a week. Ken Anderson had every one of these reports in his file. He had disclosed none of them to the defense, not one. Rayleigh kept reading. Then he found the document that changed everything. It was a report written by Sergeant Don Woods, the chief investigator on the case. It described a conversation that had taken place on the day of Christine's funeral between Christine's mother, Rita Kirkpatrick, and her 3-year-old grandson, Eric. Rita had written down every word the boy said, verbatim. Rayleigh read it slowly. "Mommy's crying. Stop it. Go away. 'Cause the monster's here. He hit Mommy. The monster threw the blue suitcase on the bed. He's mad. No, Mommy, stop. Mommy went to the hospital. And then Rita asked the most important question she would ever ask her grandson. Was Daddy there, Eric? No. Mommy and Eric was there. That document was in Ken Anderson's file. He had read it. He had known. He sent Michael Morton to prison for life anyway. He stood in front of Christine's family and told them Michael was guilty. He stood in front of Eric's caregivers and told them Michael was guilty. He accepted Prosecutor of the Year. He accepted a judgeship. He built an entire second career on the foundation of this conviction, while a 3-year-old boy's eyewitness account sat in a folder, untouched, going nowhere. But there was one detail in that transcript that no one had understood at the time. Eric had not just said monster. He had said the big monster with the big mustache. When Rayleigh saw a photograph of Mark Allen Norwood for the first time, he stopped. Norwood had a large, prominent mustache. A 3-year-old child, on the day of his mother's funeral, had described his mother's killer with enough physical precision to identify him, and the man assigned to investigate had told Rita that the monster was probably just Eric's father, that the boy simply hadn't recognized him in the chaos. Eric grew up believing that. By the time he was old enough to question it, the memory was gone entirely. Then the laboratory results arrived. The blood on the bandana matched Christine Morton. And it also matched a man who was not Michael. The DNA profile was entered into CODIS, the national database containing the genetic profiles of convicted offenders across the country. The match came back immediately. The name was Mark Allen Norwood, born in 1954. His family had settled in Austin in 1970. His criminal history ran across multiple states, receiving stolen property, aggravated assault, arson, burglary. At the time of Christine's murder in 1986, he had been living near the Morton home. Investigators began pulling his background apart. They found a man named Louis Wan, a former co-worker of Norwood's, who had since moved to Nashville. Wan had something to show them. A gun. A .45 Colt Commander that Norwood had sold him in 1986, the same year Christine Morton was murdered. It was the gun stolen from the Morton home the morning she died. Norwood had killed her, taken her husband's gun, and sold it to a coworker within the same year. For 25 years, that gun had been sitting in Nashville while Michael Morton sat in a cell in East Texas. But Norwood had not stopped with Christine. January 13, 1988. 16 months after Christine Morton was murdered, a woman named Deborah Baker was found dead in her home in Austin. She was 34 years old, brunette, and the mother of a 3-year-old child. She lost her life in an identical attack within her home, her belongings taken, and the scene staged to delay discovery. Norwood had lived one street corner away. The signature was identical. 2 brunette mothers in their 30s, both with toddlers, both murdered in their waterbeds on a Wednesday the 13th of the month. The killer had used the exact same entry, the exact same method, and the exact same calendar date. He had done it twice, entirely unhindered, because the state had already locked the wrong man away and closed the book. DNA recovered from pubic hair at the Baker crime scene matched Norwood directly. There was no longer any question. Barry Scheck said it plainly. I think Eric described him well as a monster. They never looked for the monster. On November 9, 2011, Mark Allen Norwood was arrested at his mother's home in Bastrop, Texas. He was 57 years old. He had been free for 25 years. The monster finally had a name. Michael Morton was about to walk out of prison. But the man who had made all of this possible, who had hidden the files, buried the evidence, silenced a child's testimony, and built a career on the back of a lie, was still sitting on a bench in Williamson County, wearing a judge's robe. What happens to him is something that had never happened before in the entire history of American law. October 4, 2011. Michael Morton walked out of prison. He was 57 years old. He had been inside for 24 years and 7 months. He stepped into a fall afternoon in Texas and tilted his head back toward the sun. Someone asked him about it later. Had he felt the sun in all those years? He said, I'd felt the sun, but I hadn't felt free sun. And free sun feels different. It sounds stupid, but it feels different. 1 month later, Mark Allen Norwood was arrested at his mother's home in Bastrop. In March 2013, his trial was moved to San Angelo. The media coverage in Central Texas had made a fair local jury impossible to find. A Tom Green County jury deliberated and found Norwood guilty of capital murder for the 1986 killing of Christine Morton. Life in prison. Because the crime occurred in 1986, he was sentenced under the laws of that year, which meant he would be eligible for parole in 15 years. Christine's own family had asked prosecutors not to seek the death penalty. They had been through enough. Michael stood outside the courthouse afterward and said what he meant. It's not a time to celebrate. It's not a happy day. Later that year, Norwood was convicted of capital murder for the death of Deborah Baker as well. 2 life sentences, to be served one after the other. The monster was caged, but the architect was still free. Ken Anderson had spent 2 years watching the case he built collapse from the inside. He had stood in front of cameras after Michael's exoneration and said, without hesitation, "In my heart, I know there was no misconduct whatsoever." Now a special criminal inquiry, a proceeding so rare it required convening by the Texas Supreme Court, was assembled specifically to determine whether Anderson had committed criminal acts in the original prosecution. He took the stand. His voice cracked. He called the case his worst nightmare. He said his office had gotten it right as much as humanly possible. His own lawyer told the court that the precise details of what Anderson had known, the green van, the credit card, the forged check, the child's transcript, were, in his words, lost to the sands of time. The court did not agree. The inquiry found probable cause to believe Anderson had withheld exculpatory evidence, tampered with government records, and failed to comply with a direct judicial order. He was charged with criminal contempt. He faced up to 10 years in prison. In November 2013, he entered a plea deal. He surrendered his law license permanently. The state bar treated it as full disbarment. He resigned from the bench. He was sentenced to 10 days in jail, with 1 day's credit for time already served. He served 9 days. He was fined $500. 9 days. For 25 years of a man's life. For a child who grew up without a father. For Deborah Baker, who died because the real killer was never found. 9 days and $500. And yet, it was historic. Since 1989, 729 people in the United States have been wrongfully convicted in cases involving prosecutorial misconduct. Before Ken Anderson walked into that Williamson County jail, not one prosecutor in American history had ever spent a single day behind bars for it. The system that produced this outcome had never once turned on itself. Ken Anderson was the first, and in the years since, he remains the only one. Michael did not stop at the courthouse door. He walked into the Texas Capitol and helped push through Senate Bill 1611. Governor Rick Perry signed it into law in 2013. It became known as the Michael Morton Act. It requires prosecutors across the state of Texas to share their complete case files, every document, every report, every piece of evidence with the defense before trial. The precise thing Ken Anderson had refused to do, the thing that had cost Michael 25 years. Now a legal requirement written into Texas law carrying Michael's name. He received nearly $2 million in compensation, $80,000 for each year he had been wrongfully imprisoned, under a Texas statute that remains among the most generous in the country. The state that took his life gave him back what money could give back, which was not everything, but it was something. During his years in prison, Michael had kept journals, more than 1,000 pages, written in a cell he could cross in 4 steps. He wrote about Christine, he wrote about Eric, he wrote about the rust and the appeals and the visits that stopped. After his release, he turned those pages into a memoir, Getting Life, an innocent man's 25-year journey from prison to peace. The New York Times called it more astonishing than any legal thriller by John Grisham. It was not fiction. It was just what happened. John Rayleigh arranged a quiet dinner at his home. No courthouse, no cameras, no guards or glass or time limits. Michael and Eric sat down together as father and son for the first time since Eric was small enough to be carried. Michael noticed their shoes were nearly identical. The same new blue jeans, the same way they held their heads, the same gait crossing the room. They shook hands first. Then it became something else, a hug that Raleigh later described as a melding, like two people returning to something that had always been there. Eric had spent the majority of his life believing his father had killed his mother. He had to take everything he thought he knew about Michael Morton and rebuild it from the ground up. Michael said afterward, "I was quite amazed at the speed at which he did it." Rayleigh watched from across the room. Michael said, "Son," and Eric said, "Dad," and just for a second I got a glimpse of what heaven must be like. Michael talked later about the anger, about what it felt like to sit in a cell and think about not just the man who killed Christine, but the men who had put him there knowing what they knew. He said he had wanted to get back at them, that the feeling was real and it lasted. And then one day he put it down. It's like I dropped 25 pounds. I just felt. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. What he said instead was this: revenge, I know, doesn't work. But accountability works. It's what balances out. It's the equilibrium. It's the social glue, because if you're not accountable, you can do anything. A man who lost 25 years, a wife, a son's childhood, and his own name within his son's life, standing in free sun. The monster found. The prosecutor jailed. The law changed. And a boy who said dad to a stranger at a dinner table and meant every word of it.